They called him the old fool on the hill until the night the mountain came alive. And the only thing standing between 40 families and a river of mud was the strange stone wall no one understood. When Hank Beckett first drove his beat-up Chevy up the gravel switchback to the property on Jessup Ridge, the whole town of Kettle Creek watched from porches and parking lots, like they were witnessing a funeral procession in reverse. A 64-year-old man with a stiff left knee, a faded army jacket, and a German shepherd riding shotgun with his head out the window. That was all. No moving truck, no family car following behind. Just Hank, the dog, and whatever fit in the truck bed under a blue tarp. Scout jumped out before the engine died, landing in the tall grass with his nose already working. Ears turning, tail level, scanning the overgrown lot like he was clearing a compound. The cabin at the top of the ridge was small, cedar-sided, missing half its gutters. Hank's late cousin Virgil had left it to him in a will nobody expected, least of all Hank. He hadn't spoken to Virgil in 9 years. But the deed was real, the land was paid off, and Hank needed somewhere that wasn't a VA hospital waiting room. He stood at the edge of the gravel and looked down. Kettle Creek spread below like a painting. A strip of shops along the river, a white church steeple, rooftops tucked between oaks and maples. The kind of town that looked peaceful from a distance and suspicious up close. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Scout circled back and pressed his flank against Hank's leg. Hank reached down without looking, fingers finding the spot behind Scout's left ear that always settled both of them. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see what we've got." What he had was a hillside that made his stomach drop. The slope behind the cabin ran steep, 40 degrees at least, thick with loose soil and shallow-rooted pines. Below, the ground leveled into a natural drainage channel that funneled straight toward the homes at the base of the ridge. Every gully, every crease in the land pointed downhill, like arrows aimed at the town. Hank had seen terrain like this before, not here. In Honduras, during a joint relief mission after Hurricane Mitch. He'd watched an entire village slide off a mountainside in the middle of the night. Heard it first. A sound like the earth clearing its throat, then screaming, then nothing. He shook the memory loose and crouched to press his palm flat against the soil. Wet. Too wet for early September, Scout whined, low and short. "Yeah," Hank muttered. "I don't like it either." The next morning, Hank drove into town for supplies. He parked outside Benson's Hardware, and before he'd closed the truck door, heads were already turning. A woman in a quilted vest nudged her friend. 2 men outside the barber shop stopped mid-conversation. Scout stayed in the truck, watching through the windshield with the calm intensity of a dog who'd spent 3 tours reading rooms full of strangers. Inside the hardware store, Hank loaded a cart with stakes, string line, a pick mattock, and 4 bags of gravel. The kid behind the register, maybe 19, stared at the pile. "Building a patio? Drainage," Hank said. "For what? For rain?" The kid blinked. "It barely rained all summer." Hank paid and left without explaining. On his way to the truck, a thick voice caught him from across the street. Darrell Mosby leaned against his own truck, arms crossed, ball cap low. He was the kind of man who'd inherited enough land to feel important, and done just little enough with it to prove he wasn't. "You the one bought Virgil's place?" Hank nodded. "Heard you're military." "Was." Darrell looked at the supplies in Hank's truck bed. "What's all that for?" "The hill needs work." Darrell snorted. "That hill's been there longer than both of us. Don't need some outsider rearranging it." Scout growled from the cab. A sound so low it barely registered, but Darrell heard it. His smirk faltered for half a second before he recovered. "Friendly dog," Darrell muttered, walking away. Hank climbed in and scratched Scout's chest. "Ignore him." But Scout watched Darrell's reflection in the side mirror until the man disappeared. The digging started the next day. Hank worked from sunrise, cutting a trench along the upper slope behind the cabin. 18 inches deep, angled precisely, lined with gravel at the base. Scout paced the perimeter while Hank swung the mattock, each strike measured, each angle deliberate. He wasn't guessing, He'd sketched the layout the night before in a battered field notebook, calculating slope grade, water volume, and soil saturation thresholds the way he used to calculate fire positions. By noon, a county roads truck slowed on the gravel below. Two men in reflective vests watched from the cab. One rolled down his window. "Hey, you digging a swimming pool up there?" Hank didn't look up. "Drainage channel." "For what? Hasn't flooded around here in 20 years. That's what people always say right before it does." The men exchanged a look and drove on. Word traveled. By the end of the week, Hank Beckett's trenches were the talk of Kettle Creek. At the diner, at the post office, at the gas station where men gathered around coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during the previous administration. Everywhere, the same joke. The old soldier thinks he's fighting the mountain. June Whitfield was the only one who didn't laugh. She ran the small library next to the post office and brought Hank a box of donated books his second week in town. She stood at the edge of his property looking at the trenches and asked a question no one else had. "Where does the water go?" Hank looked at her, surprised. "Down the east side, away from the houses, into the old quarry basin." June nodded slowly. "That's smart." "It's not smart. It's basic. Around here, basic is smart. People don't think about the ground under their feet." She left the books on the porch and walked back down the hill. Scout watched her go without growling, which Hank took as a good sign. The trenches grew into something larger. Hank stacked stone along the upper channel, building a low retaining wall that curved along the contour of the slope. He hauled rock from the old quarry by hand, loading the truck bed until the suspension groaned. Each stone was placed with purpose, interlocked, angled to deflect rather than dam. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't meant to be. Sheriff Pete Langford showed up on a Tuesday afternoon, leaning against his cruiser with the weary expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Hank, Sheriff, getting calls about your project." "What kind of calls?" "The kind where people worry you're building a bunker." Hank set down the stone in his hands. "It's a retaining wall with a diversion channel, designed to redirect surface water during heavy rainfall." Langford scratched his jaw. "The Weather Service says we're looking at a dry October." Weather Service said Katrina would be a Category 3. The sheriff sighed. "Look, I'm not here to stop you. Just maybe dial it back a little. Folks are getting creative with their theories. I don't control what people think." "No, but you could try not scaring them." Scout appeared at Hank's side, sitting perfectly straight, eyes locked on the sheriff. Langford took a step back. "That dog ever relax when there's nothing to watch for?" Langford left. Hank picked up the next stone. The nights were harder than the days, not because of the work, but because the dark brought everything. Hank spent daylight out running. The cabin creaked in the wind, and sometimes the creaking sounded like canvas snapping over a field tent. Sometimes the silence between gusts sounded like the silence between mortar rounds. One night, Hank woke, gasping, hands gripping the blanket like it was a stretcher. The room was black, his chest hammered. For 3 terrible seconds, he wasn't in West Virginia. He was in a valley in eastern Afghanistan, watching a flash flood rip through a forward operating base that someone had built too close to a dry riverbed. The water came at night, no warning. Just a wall of brown water and the sound of metal bending. He'd pulled 2 men out, couldn't reach the third. Scout was on him before the memory finished. The dog climbed onto the cot and pressed his full weight against Hank's chest, 70 pounds of warmth and certainty. Hank wrapped his arms around Scout's neck and breathed, in, out. In, out. The cabin walls returned. The mountain wind replaced the roar of water. "Okay," Hank whispered, voice ragged. "I'm here." Then Scout didn't move until Hank's heartbeat slowed. Only then did the dog shift to his side, keeping one paw on Hank's arm, a tether to the present. "I'm not building this for me," Hank said into the dark. "You know that, right?" Scout's ear twitched. "I'm building it because I know what water does when nobody's ready." Hank lay awake until dawn, then got up and started digging again. 3 weeks in, the wall stretched 200 feet along the upper slope. The diversion channel ran clean and deep, angled to push runoff toward the empty quarry basin east of town. Hank had reinforced the channel bed with crushed stone and packed clay. He'd built 2 overflow catch basins at the steepest points. From the road below, the whole thing looked like the work of a madman who'd declared war on his own property. Darrell Mosby made sure everyone knew it too. He took photos from the road and showed them around at the diner. Fort Crazy, he called it. His buddies laughed. Even the waitress smiled, though she tried to hide it. "Man's digging his own grave up there," Darrell said, loud enough for the whole room. "Somebody should call the VA. Get him a nice room with soft walls." The laughter carried. It always did in small towns. But Hank kept working, and Scout kept watching. October arrived, and the sky stayed clear, blue and crisp, not a cloud for days. The town relaxed. People stopped driving past Hank's place to stare. The jokes got old. Hank became background noise, just the strange veteran on the hill, harmless, probably a little broken. Then the weather shifted. It started on a Thursday night. Hank stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunset. The sky to the west didn't look right. The clouds had that greenish bruise he'd seen only a handful of times in his life, and every time something bad followed. Scout stood rigid beside him, nose pointed west, ears flat. Hank set down his coffee. "You smell it?" The dog whined, high and tight. Hank went inside and turned on the weather radio. The broadcast was routine. Rain expected Friday through Saturday. An inch, maybe 2. Nothing unusual. But the barometric pressure on Hank's old analog gauge told a different story. It was dropping fast. Too fast, the kind of drop that meant the atmosphere was collapsing into itself, pulling moisture from every direction. He drove into town the next morning, found Sheriff Langford outside the station. "You need to warn people," Hank said. "What's coming isn't a regular storm." Langford frowned. "Forecast says 2 inches max. Forecast is wrong. Pressure's crashing. The ground's already saturated from the late summer rains. 2 inches on this terrain, on soil this loose. It won't take much." "Hank, I appreciate the concern, but I watched a flood kill 3 soldiers because command trusted a forecast instead of reading the ground. I'm not asking you to panic. I'm asking you to tell people to move anything valuable off their ground floors and stay away from the base of the ridge." Langford studied him for a long moment. "I'll mention it loud." Hank drove back up the hill. The clouds thickened through the afternoon. By evening, the first drops fell, fat, heavy drops that hit the cabin roof like pebbles. Scout paced the cabin, unable to settle. Hank checked every joint in the retaining wall, cleared debris from the channel, stacked sandbags at the 2 overflow points. Then he sat on the porch with Scout and waited. The rain came hard after midnight. Not the steady, soaking rain the forecast promised. This was a downpour that turned the air into a wall of water. Rain hammered the roof so loud, Hank couldn't hear his own voice. Wind drove it sideways through the trees, bending pines until they touched the ground. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in an hour. Scout barked. Sharp. Urgent. Hank looked at the slope behind the cabin. In the beam of his flashlight, he saw the channel doing exactly what he'd built it to do. Water surged along the trench, brown and fast, carrying leaves and small stones, but moving east, away from the town. The retaining wall held, redirecting the flow like a river hitting a levee. Below, Kettle Creek was not so fortunate. The sound came first, a deep, wet groan from somewhere on the ridge, then a crack, like a tree snapping but longer, deeper. The ground itself was moving. Hank grabbed the radio, static. He tried his phone, no signal. The power had gone out an hour ago, and the cell tower on Miller's Peak was probably drowning. Scout barked again, spinning toward the downhill path. Hank listened. Through the roar of rain he heard it, faint, desperate. A voice screaming for help. "Scout, find." The dog shot into the rain without hesitation. Hank tied a rope around his waist, anchored the other end to the porch beam, and followed. They found Mabel Surrency first. The 81-year-old widow lived in a small cottage at the base of the ridge. Muddy water was already knee-deep around her porch. She stood in her doorway in a nightgown, clutching the frame, too terrified to move. "Hank!" She couldn't believe what she was seeing. What's happening? The slope's giving way. We need to get you up the hill. I can't walk in this. You don't have to. Lean on me. He lifted her arm over his shoulder. Scout pressed against her other side, stabilizing her as they climbed through the mud. The old woman weighed almost nothing, but the terrain fought every step. Rain blinded them. Mud sucked at their boots. Twice Hank slipped, and twice Scout braced against him. 70 pounds of anchor, holding them upright. They got Mabel to the cabin and wrapped her in blankets by the stove. Hank turned back toward the door. "Where are you going?" Mabel cried. "There are others down there." Scout was already at the door, waiting. They went back out. The rain had intensified. Hank could barely see 10 feet ahead, but Scout moved with certainty, nose cutting through the storm. They found Pete Langford's deputy, a young man named Wes, pinned under a fallen fence post near the church parking lot. Hank hauled the post off him while Scout circled, barking to keep Wes conscious. They dragged him uphill, back to the cabin, back out again. The third trip nearly killed them. A section of the ridge below Darrell Mosby's property had given way completely. A tongue of mud and rock had slid across the road, burying a truck and pushing debris against the front of the Mosby house. Through the rain, Hank heard a child screaming. His blood went cold. "Scout! Go!" Scout plunged through the mudslide debris, scrambling over broken timber and rock. Hank followed, the rope running out behind him. They found Cody Mosby, 11 years old, standing on the cab of the buried truck, water and mud rising around him. The boy was soaked, shaking, his voice gone hoarse from screaming. "Cody, take my hand," the boy reached. Hank grabbed him and pulled him off the truck just as another surge of mud pushed the vehicle sideways. Scout barked frantically, herding them toward higher ground. Hank carried the boy on his back. His knee screamed, his lungs burned, but he climbed. Halfway up, a shape appeared in the rain. Darrell Mosby, wild-eyed, covered in mud. "Cody, oh God, Cody!" "He's okay," Hank shouted. "Take him to my cabin." Darrell grabbed his son, clutching the boy so hard both of them shook. He looked at Hank through the rain, and every joke, every sneer, every Fort Crazy died in his eyes. "Go," Hank said. "Now." They ran. Hank turned back. Scout barked once, sharp and high. "I know." One more. They found June Whitfield trapped in the library. Water had flooded the ground floor, and she'd climbed to the second-story window. Hank waded through waist-deep water to reach the building. Scout swam beside him, head above the current, legs churning. "Jump," Hank called up. "It's too far. I'll catch you." "Jump." She jumped. Hank caught her, staggered, and Scout pressed against his legs to keep all three of them from going under. They fought their way back toward the ridge, following the rope line, climbing through mud that tried to swallow them whole. When they finally reached the cabin, Hank collapsed against the porch rail. His arms shook. His knee had swollen to twice its size. Mud caked every inch of him. Inside, 8 people huddled around the stove. Mabel prayed softly. Wes held a compress to his ribs. Darrell sat on the floor with Cody in his lap, rocking the boy gently, tears cutting clean tracks through the mud on his face. Scout limped through the door behind Hank. The dog's back left leg dragged slightly. He'd cut it on debris during the last rescue, a gash along the pad that left red prints on the floor. Hank dropped to his knees beside Scout. The dog licked his hand, then his face, then tried to stand again, because there might be someone else out there. "No," Hank said, his voice breaking. "You're done, buddy. You did enough." Scout resisted for a moment, ears straining toward the storm. Then he lay down beside Hank, resting his head on his paws, one eye still watching the door. June knelt beside them. His paw. "I know." Hank tore a strip from a dry towel and wrapped Scout's foot, gentle as if handling glass. The dog whimpered once but didn't pull away. Outside, the storm raged, but the cabin held. The retaining wall held. The diversion channel roared with runoff, pushing thousands of gallons away from the town, toward the quarry basin, where it could pool without killing anyone. Darrell stood slowly, Cody still pressed against him. He walked to Hank and stood there for a long time without speaking. "I called you crazy," he finally said. "I called you crazy every bandaged month. Hank didn't look up from Scout's bandaged paw. Doesn't matter now. It matters to me. Daryl's voice cracked. You saved my boy. Scout saved your boy. I just followed him. Scout's tail moved once. Slow, tired but definite. The rain didn't stop until the following afternoon. When it finally eased, the damage revealed itself in the gray light. 3 homes at the base of the ridge were buried under mud. The church parking lot had become a pond. Roads were impassable. Trees lay across power lines like fallen soldiers. But nobody had died, not one person. The county emergency team arrived by helicopter that evening. They found the survivors in Hank's cabin, warm, fed, alive. The paramedics treated Scout first, at Hank's insistence. The dog accepted the attention with dignity, holding still while they cleaned and sutured his paw, only flinching once. Sheriff Langford found Hank on the porch afterward, staring at the valley below. You tried to tell me, the sheriff said. Yeah. I should have listened. Hank didn't answer. There was nothing to say that the mountain hadn't already said louder. Langford sat beside him. People want to hear from you. When this settles, they want to understand. Hank shook his head slowly. They want to understand why an old man dug trenches in his yard. They want to understand how you knew. The town meeting happened 4 days later, in the high school gymnasium, because the town hall had 2 feet of silt on its floor. Hank walked in with Scout at his side, the dog's paw still bandaged but his steps steady. The gym was packed. Families who'd lost property sat next to families whose homes had been spared by feet. Children sat cross-legged on the floor. The room went quiet the moment Hank appeared. He didn't walk to the podium. He stopped in the middle of the floor, where everyone could see him, and pulled the same field notebook from his back pocket. In 2003, he said, I was stationed at a forward operating base in Kunar province. They built it at the bottom of a valley next to a dry riverbed. Efficient location. Easy resupply route. Smart on paper. The room was silent. November 4th, the rains came. 3 inches in 2 hours. The riverbed filled in minutes. Water came through the base like a freight train. Took the communications tent first, then the mess hall, then the barracks where 14 men were sleeping. He paused. Scout leaned against his leg. I pulled 2 of them out. Couldn't reach the 3rd. His name was Corporal Adam Sellers. He was 23 years old and he drowned in a country with no ocean because someone trusted a map instead of reading the ground. Daryl Mosby lowered his head. Several women in the room wiped their eyes. I don't tell this story for sympathy, Hank continued. I tell it because that night I made a promise. If I ever had land on a slope above a town, I would not let water come down that hill and take people in their sleep. That's what the channel is. It's not a bunker. It's not a fort. It's the thing I owed Adam Sellers. He opened the notebook and held it up. Sketches of retaining walls, channel grades, overflow calculations. The same kind of drawings a man makes when the math is the only thing standing between what happened before and what he swore would never happen again. I'll teach anyone who wants to learn, he said. Every ridge property in Kettle Creek should have basic water diversion. It's not expensive. It's not complicated. It just takes someone willing to dig when the sun's still shining. Daryl stood. His voice was rough. I'll dig. Mabel Surency raised a shaking hand. I'll bring water for the workers. June smiled. I'll organize the schedule. One by one, hands went up. Not applause. Something quieter and more permanent. Spring came early that year. The dogwoods bloomed white along the ridgeline, and the sound of hammers and shovels echoed across Kettle Creek every Saturday morning. Hank moved from property to property with his notebook, showing people where to cut channels, where to stack stone, where the water would want to go, and how to tell it otherwise. Scout came with him everywhere, fully healed now. His limp gone, his paw scarred but strong. Children followed the dog like he was a celebrity. One girl made him a bandana that read Chief Engineer in fabric paint. Scout wore it for an entire week before burying it in Mabel's garden. Daryl Mosby became Hank's most reliable volunteer. He showed up first and left last, hauling stone without complaint, asking questions he never would have asked a month before. One afternoon, as they stacked the final course of a wall behind the church, Darrell stopped and looked at Hank. "I spent my whole life in this town thinking I knew this land." Hank set a stone in place. "You know the land, you just weren't listening to it." Darrell nodded slowly. "I'm listening now." By summer, 9 properties had functioning diversion systems. The retaining walls caught the light in the evenings, warm, gray stone, tracing the contours of the ridge like veins in a leaf. They weren't beautiful by any traditional measure, but they were solid. They were deliberate, and they were built by people who now understood what water could do when no one was paying attention. On a warm evening in late June, the town held a cookout at the base of the ridge. Tables stretched across the grass, smoke rose from grills. Children chased fireflies while their parents talked about rain gauges and soil types, subjects nobody in Kettle Creek had ever discussed at a party before. Sheriff Langford tapped a bottle with a fork until the noise settled. "6 months ago," he said, "a man moved to this town and started digging in his yard. We called him names I'm not proud of. We laughed. We pointed. We acted like people who thought comfort meant safety." He looked at Hank, who sat at a far table, with Scout at his feet, uncomfortable with the attention. "He didn't build those walls for himself. He built them for us, before he even knew us, and when the worst night this town has ever seen came down on our heads, he and that dog walked into the dark to pull us out." Langford raised his bottle, to Hank Beckett, and to Scout, the best neighbors Kettle Creek ever had. The crowd didn't just cheer, they stood, every single one of them. Scout barked once. Short, proud. Hank looked down at the dog and scratched behind his ear. "You started it," he said quietly. Later, when the party thinned and the stars came out thick as dust over the ridge, Hank and Scout walked home together. The air smelled like cut grass and hickory smoke. From every house along the road, warm light spilled through windows. At the top of the hill, Hank stopped. He rested his hand on the first stone he'd placed weeks ago when nobody believed him. It was cool under his palm, solid, patient. Scout pressed against his leg and sighed. "Adam," Hank whispered into the night air. "I kept the promise." The mountain didn't answer, but the wind carried the words up, past the ridge, past the tree line, past the place where the stars began. And for the first time in 20 years, Hank Beckett stood on a hill, above a sleeping town, and felt no fear of what the rain might bring, because this time, they were ready. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. Just something small to let me know you're still here with us on this journey. And if Hank and Scout's courage meant something to you today, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories of loyalty, survival, and second chances coming your way. And I'd be honored to have you with us for the next one. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the comments.